Hello, my name is Jason Collings, and I write a series of historical mystery novels called the Alaricvontrelowmysteries, set in the Weimar Republic. And almost everything in my novels actually happened. I made a conscious decision about this because I began as a historian. I trained as a historian. I went through the university process at Oxford University as a historian. And so for me, the historical veracity of the stories I tell is incredibly important. And that means that as much as possible, in the stories is real. It actually happened. The places are the places, the things they talk about, the objects they use are real in as far as I can make them. And this includes, and I really mean this, the parts you're most likely to think I've invented for effect. Um, it is a working method, and it's also a kind of promise to you, the reader. So I'm going to take a few minutes to go through and just give a few examples of what I mean. And by the end, I hope you understand the single rule that the series is built on. I will tell you what I am inventing, and I'm very rarely inventing as much as you think. Let's start with one of the more recent books. The book is The Ngoni Princess. And in that book, my main character travels to Africa, to East Africa, what was German East Africa, and has then become the Tanganyika territory and is now Tanzania. And there he is dealing with the fallout of the Great War in Africa and its transfer from German colonial administration to British colonial administration. And what has happened is something remarkable and unique. The army that was defending that territory, a small colonial defense force, in German a Schutztruppe, has successfully managed to fight off the might of the British Empire, the Belgians, the Portuguese, who are surrounding them and have been consistently trying to capture them, destroy them, wipe out their fighting capacity for the entirety of the First World War. And led by a remarkable historical character, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, they successfully avoided capture and fought those enemies to a standstill. It is a remarkable story, and it is built on the courage and fighting capacity of the native troops, the Askari, who were regarded by their enemies, wherever they came from, as some of the finest fighting men in the world. It's a great story, and I encourage you to go and look at the history of that campaign. What I wanted to do, though, was talk a little about the aftermath, because that conflict was incredibly bloody, not so much for the troops, although they suffered, but for the civilians. Hundreds of thousands of native Africans died, not so much as a result of direct fighting, but by being used as bearers, taken away from their territory to areas where they became more susceptible to the local diseases that killed them, to famine, to exhaustion. Their families robbed of the men who brought in the harvest, often starved. It was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And it's now, as a campaign, as part of history, and as a price that has been paid for colonial greed, it's almost entirely forgotten. And so I wanted to bring that to people's attention, and that's why it is in there in the book, The Ngoni Princess. The second I want to talk about is about the second book in my series, The November Criminals. That is based around a real jewel, and you'll see it on the cover of that book. If you look at it, there is a huge diamond, and that diamond, 34.98 carats, is known as lebeausancy. It was originally found in the Golconda mines of India. It was passed to Marie de Medici. She eventually passed it on, and it ended up in the treasury of the princes of Orange, who in turn became the kings of England. And then, via various machinations of inheritance, it ended up being part of the crown jewels of Prussia. And it was in the crown jewels of Prussia in 1918, and it was in Berlin. And this is the Berlin that at that point is in the state of revolution. And there it disappears from history. It disappears until 1945, when some British soldiers find it bricked up in a crypt, of all things. And that made me go, what the hell? Where did this huge gem, one of the largest diamonds in the world, where did it disappear for that period in between? Was it in that crypt the whole time? Did somebody take it and hide it there and never get to go back and collect it? And so I began to create a story around that gem and what might have happened to it. The story about what happens to it is, of course, fictional, but the events that happen around there, around the revolution that happens in November 1918, they are true. Let's move on then to the next book in the series, which is Red Berlin, because there is more real history that is forgotten. I set Red Berlin after the red events that everyone knows in Berlin's history, and that's the Spartacist revolt of 1919, January 1919, to be specific. And most people who know anything about this period or German history know that the Spartacists that later became the communists, or at that time becoming the communists, the KPD, attempted to overthrow the German government. That's rubbish, by the way. They never really attempted that. It was ludicrous that they could have even thought of it. It was more of a desperate last throw of the dice protest by the communists. They didn't realistically believe that they could seize power. Certainly, Rosa Luxemburg, one of the two leaders of the Communist Party, didn't believe that it could work. But they went along with it because they saw any chance of power slipping away. And Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the other leader, they were famously captured. They were killed, murdered by the right-wing Freikorps, and Rosa Luxemburg's body was dumped into a canal where it wasn't found for 6 months. All particularly horrible. But what to me is more horrible is what happened afterwards. And this is the piece that's forgotten. And this is the piece that I wrote into Red Berlin. Is that in the immediate aftermath, the Freikorps were unleashed on the working class districts of Berlin. And in March of 1919, they went wild. They stormed into the eastern parts of the city, the working class districts, and they brought with them equipment of war. And by equipment of war, I don't mean a few pistols and rifles, which is what people imagine when they think of the Freikorps. Paramilitaries, they've got a rifle, they've got some handguns. No, that wasn't it at all. These men were being called paramilitaries because they couldn't admit that they were military, but they were equipped like the military. They came in with tripod-mounted machine guns, with mortars, with hand grenades, with flamethrowers, with armoured cars. They even had at least one captured British tank that they were using. They dropped bombs from planes on civilian areas of their own cities. And people remember the Tulsa riots and the American army bombing Tulsa. That's years later. They don't remember that in 1919, the Germans turned around and sent armed men into their own city. And this isn't a right wing, this isn't the Nazi government sending in these troops. This is a socialist, an SPD government who allowed these troops to be unleashed upon their own civilians. A minimum of 1,200 people died. It could be as many as 3,000. Records are really unclear. But it deserves to be remembered, I think. And that's why I wrote it into the book, Red Berlin. One of the guiding underlying pressures of the early part of the Weimar period is the mounting inflation, which comes to a peak famously in 1923, the year that money died, as it's known. And this pressure sits behind a lot of the books I write. It's not there in a massive way early on. It's just mentioned, and then it becomes greater and greater and greater. There's the momentum builds, and inflation ramps higher and higher and higher. For those who don't know, it basically went from a point where in 1913 a American dollar would buy you about 4.2 marks. By 1923, a decade later, it was about 4.2 trillion. Absolutely insane. I won't reiterate the stories about how worthless the banknotes were. They're plentiful and they're out there. But essentially, money had ceased to have any value at all. And when I started writing the stories, the Alaric von Trello mysteries, I thought about what I wanted my character to be like. I wanted him to be a war veteran. I wanted him to carry those scars. I wanted him to have a number of different characteristics, which I've spoken about in other videos and I'll speak about again. But one of the things I decided was I wanted him to be rich, not out of some wish fulfillment or something, but because there are lots of noir-esque stories about detectives scraping by, whether it's someone like Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe. And I didn't want that. I didn't want him to have to be worrying about every penny or pfennig that he was earning. And so I decided I wanted to make him rich. But against this context, against the context of money becoming increasingly less and less and less valuable, that created an issue. How can I make that happen? And then that became itself an impetus for a story. And so one of the things that you will discover if you read the stories is that despite the inflationary pressures, Alaric von Trello isn't getting poorer. He's getting richer. And to begin with, maybe you read that and go, oh, well, the author has just decided he doesn't want to deal with it. Or maybe he loves his character too much and he doesn't want him to suffer. All perfectly reasonable assumptions, but wrong. It's a deliberate choice, and it's one that I'm not going to explain at this point. But I hope if you follow the stories, you will begin to enjoy where it is going, because I don't explain it, and I'm not going to explain it now, but the character doesn't understand it entirely either. He doesn't know, for all his intellect, for all his education, for all his understanding and his ability to solve problems, he doesn't know really why he's getting richer and richer and richer. And it's kind of explained, but he still doesn't quite get it because nobody really quite understood at this time. And he is being manipulated. And we will discover who by in later stories. But for me, it was important to show that pressure that cut both ways. Not everybody got poor. Some people got rich. Some people got super rich. They took more and more and more of the pie. And that for me was resonant. It was resonant to our current world where very, very rich people are taking more and more and more of the pie and leaving less and less for everybody else. So here's the promise. I write stories that I hope are entertaining, that I hope are fun, but they are based on real history. The campaigns, the coups, the killings, the rigged verdicts, wherever possible, I make them real. The characters are fictional, but they are moving through a real world. They are moving through real history. And that to me was incredibly important. And the reason it was incredibly important was I set out to write stories that made people feel what it was like to live through the Weimar era. And the reason that that was important for me was this was the first modern democracy that died. It became an authoritarian state, a fascist state, the Nazi state. And I can write about why that happened. I can write about how that happened. I could go and write a history book. I could go and write a textbook. And it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. So why didn't you? And the reason I didn't was because I don't think people remember that. I don't think people really in their heart feel it. And you need to feel something to really, really understand it. And so I started writing in early 2023, in fact, on New Year's Day 2023. And I wanted to write stories that I found interesting, the sort of stories that I would want to read. But I also wanted to give a little warning, a little heads up, a little, hey guys, this feels really familiar, and not in a good way, because things are going on, things that don't feel good and feel very reminiscent. And that's not to say that history repeats itself. It absolutely doesn't. It doesn't even exactly echo or rhyme or whatever the particular analogy or metaphor you want to use. But people do similar things when they are put under similar pressures and given similar opportunities. And we are seeing a lot of those things happening again. And 100 years ago, in one of the most sophisticated nations on earth, in a democracy that had been designed to be proofed against exactly this kind of thing happening, it died, and the worst kind of authoritarianism took over. And so I wanted to write stories that didn't preach. They're fun. You can read them and walk away and think nothing more about them. That's the point. But it's also the point, and equally the point, that you can feel what it was like to be there. You can read one of those stories and come away and go, ooh, yeah, I recognize that, and that makes me think. And I really hope that both those things occur, that people do enjoy them as stories, but also maybe they think a little afterwards. Thanks very much. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope enormously that you enjoy the books. And if you enjoy this content, please follow or subscribe. Thanks very much.